Hi, I'm Jesse Mangan.
And I'm Rob Wipond, and this is PsychForce Report TV. And today we're going to talk about a recent article I did for the website Mad in America, web magazine and blogging community. And it's about something called Protection and Advocacy organizations, and particularly a subcommittee that works with those that we're going to talk about more in a minute. But basically, I was looking at the extraordinary importance of some of these organizations and the work they do, as well as some opportunities they have to maybe be much more forceful in their attempts to fight against psychiatric coercion, along with a new movement that is arising to try to see if they can make that happen. So, Jesse, do you want to kind of lead us off with some of the first parts of what we talk about in the article?
Yeah, first, let's talk about the history of protection and advocacy organizations. So, the history of protection and advocacy organizations goes back to the early 70s, and it really sort of was kicked off by an investigation in New York State by then investigative journalist Geraldo Rivera into the state facility Willowbrook. It's had other names over the years, but there was a state facility in New York called Willowbrook that was receiving a lot of state money and reached a point of abuse, neglect, and horror, really, that's kind of hard to fathom. The things happening there were gross and horrific. And so this investigative journalist went in with a camera, caught footage of the abuse, and it was broadcast. And once people actually saw what was happening in this facility, there was a bipartisan, nearly unanimous sort of agreement that we need to do something about this. We need to set up a system that monitors for this sort of abuse. They set up in the, I think, mid 70s, the Protection and Advocacy Organization. Every state and territory within the US has a P&A. A governor appoints an organization to be the state's P&A, and they have some really impressive and robust investigative authorities to be a sort of watchdog within the state that is receiving federal money and federal statutory power to investigate reports of abuse.
Right. And that expanded in the 1980s to include specific focus on people diagnosed or labeled with mental illnesses, in particular with the Protection Advocacy for Individuals with Mental Illness Act of 1986, or sometimes called PAIMI. And that created a advisory group for the P&As. And just so people know, if you want to look it up in your state, they're often called Disability Rights New York or Disability Rights followed by your state, but not always. So you can otherwise look up Protection and Advocacy Organization in your state, and they'll usually have a website that informs you about some of the work that they do.
Yeah, the easiest way to do that is the National Disability Rights Network has a drop-down menu. And if you go to ndrn.org, drop-down menu, whatever your state and territory is, it'll tell you what the P&A is.
Right, and these organizations are federally funded. And so that's important because of their federal funding, they in some ways can kind of go up against the state level organizations, agencies that are running the mental health system there because they're funded apart from them. They may also receive some state funding, and some, indeed, a few, I think, are actually still embedded within a state agency as in their functionality. But in any case, the important part of this is they aren't necessarily with the government in that state. They're actually supposed to be holding the state and other institutions within the state to account.
PAMI is protection and advocacy for individuals with mental illness. But what that means is that SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Agency, distributes grants to every state. And that money is conditional on certain focuses. And it's really about investigating abuse or neglect related to anyone perceived to be living with a mental illness, diagnosed with a mental illness, very specifically psychiatric facilities or any facility really, nursing homes, schools, any facility where someone with a psychiatric diagnosis is living or operating or currently in. The PAMI grant gives the Protection and Advocacy Organization a certain amount of money that can be used specifically for that sort of investigation and that sort of purpose. And when they use that PAMI money, they have to, I believe it's twice a year, meet with an advisory council and go over what they did with that money. And the understanding within the statute is that advisory council is supposed to be made up of at least 60% people with lived experience.
They really do some amazing work. The collaboration between the PAIMI committees and the P&As. We've seen some astonishing sort of lawsuits that are done. Disability Rights New York looked at overuse of restraints in Bellevue Hospital, and in fact found that the record keeping around the use of chemical and physical restraints was terrible, appalling through multiple avenues. They found wildly different numbers for how often people were being tied down or overdrugged. And another example is in California, where the P&A there has exposed that there's a particular county where there's vast overrepresentation of Black people who are being involuntarily committed there relative to the population size. And there does seem to be a history of racism in that particular community. There's just some amazing work and really important and valuable work that these P&As do.
Yeah, I mean, you can go to pretty much every state and find some really prominent example. New Jersey is a great example. They have a lawsuit against the state related to CEPP, which is conditional extension pending placement, meaning that the state had a policy and a practice of people being in a civil commitment, a judge saying you don't need to be in a civil commitment anymore, and the facility holding that person for months, if not years afterwards. And so the Protection and Advocacy organization in New Jersey has initiated a lawsuit against the state for that. Massachusetts, they have on the ground investigations into a facility like Bridgewater State Hospital. So the investigative authority of the protection and advocacy organizations allows them to go to any facility where a person with disability has interaction with and investigate a claim of abuse or to show up and monitor. So throughout the decades since the P&As have been established, there are just reoccurring instances of them checking the states they operate within in terms of the expansion of abuse and neglect related to people with all sorts of disabilities.
And they also often collaborate with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division in some of these lawsuits too. So they play a very important role. That said, there is a rising voice against them, and let's talk about that for a bit. Now, a couple of people, Jim Gottstein, a prominent lawyer that works on civil rights issues within the mental health system, as well as Christina Kapp, who goes by KK, they have created something called the PAIMI Empowerment Project. And basically what they've been finding is that a lot of these PAIMI advisory groups that are supposed to have pretty significant guidance and legal authority, arguably, to influence what the P&As are investigating, they're finding that there are a lot of people who are members of these committees who are complaining that they don't feel that they have the appropriate authorities and rights to do what they want to do or to guide the P&A and what they think the P&A should be doing. And in particular, KK and Jim are highlighting the really the loss of the battle right now going on around the country against involuntary commitment. In nearly every state we look at, we see broadened powers for involuntary commitment being implemented, and these P&A organizations don't seem to have been particularly good at fighting back, and sometimes don't even fight back. And so there's a variety of questions they're raising around what's really happening at P&As around the country. And what I found during the course of my investigation is there was no shortage of people on these committees in different states who were affirming what Jim and KK were saying, that there are a lot of problems, that they don't feel listened to, that they don't feel the P&A is even necessarily against civil commitment or forced treatment. And it's just sort of, challenging some of the most egregious abuses of involuntary commitment, but not challenging involuntary commitment in itself. And they have real concerns about this. And so this empowerment project is trying to bring those people together, trying to educate others, and trying to highlight some of the powers that these PAIMI advisory committees really have. And in particular, Jim highlights in the legislation that they seem to have, in his argument, a veto power. an ability that to participate in what's called joint development of the priorities of the P&A. And essentially, in that case, because they're supposed to be jointly developed with the advisory committee and the P&A, to actually then be able to say, no, we don't want this, we want that instead. And that the PAIMI group should have that power. And they're saying that in a lot of cases, what they're seeing is they're not being allowed that degree of influence. And this is something they want to change.
Over the past several years, working on the Committable podcast, I have had some degree of contact with every state P&A throughout the United States. Not all of that contact has been meaningful, but there are many instances where the impression I get is that they do not prioritize people going through involuntary hospitalizations or civil commitments. I've had some P&As that outright say, we don't really know anything about that. And so there is a real concern related to how much respect or input and meaningful interaction there is given to an advisory board that has people with lived experience. That being said, I don't really understand the legal argument being made because the statute, at least as I'm aware of it, it comes with a lot of limitations. And the idea that because the statute says that the advisory council has to be jointly involved in establishing priorities, that doesn't mean that the P&A can then just do whatever the advisory council wants. They have very strong guardrails related to what sort of abuse and neglect they can investigate. And the reality is, from the people at protection advocacy organizations that I have talked to, there are probably a lot of attorneys there who would agree with the sentiment, but raise the concern that the statute, as they interpret it, doesn't give them the authority to represent every single person going through an involuntary hospitalization.
Yeah, that's true, Jesse, but I just want to highlight Jim's argument a little more pointedly for people out there because I think it's generally understood that they don't represent individuals. They're not mandated to do that. It would more typically be the public defender that represents an individual in a civil commitment hearing. However, what Jim tries to highlight is that they do have the authority to take precedent cases to court. So they could be challenging fundamental aspects of these laws. And he makes an argument that there are certain aspects now of mental health laws in these states that are not constitutional. And he has a whole series of arguments, which I linked to from the article around that. So, for example, that the Supreme Court, other higher courts have variously sort of affirmed that civil commitment should only be implemented in a case where there isn't some lesser intrusive approach to the person's situation. And Jim argues that if you kind of look at how bad these drugs are, how unhelpful psychiatric hospitals often are, that there are a whole variety of other options available if people really look for them and if lawyers really fight for them. So he would say they should take more of those kind of cases to court and actually challenge the very foundations of the mental health law process in this particular state or that state, where they're not really following that particular part of the statute.
Well, and I think if you spoke to an attorney at a P&A, whether or not they believed it was viable to take simply PAIMI money and launch a class action suit to try to establish a new precedent related to involuntary hospitalizations, they would probably argue that they don't have the resources to do it. They're pretty much all understaffed grossly, and they have an entire state to monitor. And with the argument being presented, I find it compelling, but most states and federal courts, it's really questionable whether or not anyone would agree with it because it is firmly established that there is some degree of involuntary hospitalization that is legal. Again, I'm not morally justifying it. I'm just saying the reality of a P&A is they have to work within the laws as established. And so when they have this limited PAMI resource and they have to question whether or not the argument they would be bringing would be effective, I think it's a very practical thing. If an advisory council were to tell a P&A, we want you to try to bring a precedent case, the P&A has to look at the resources they have available and the statute and say, can we honestly make this argument within the guardrails we're given, and do we have the resources to do it?
So Jesse, you made a lot of good points there, and yeah, I absolutely agree with you that that's clearly where the rubber's hitting the road in some of these state organizations where there's frustration maybe on both sides, even that they want to do more. They just feel overwhelmed about all the demands upon them. The P&A itself has a very broad mandate, not only now for people with labeled with mental illnesses, but for people with all forms of other disabilities that they're trying to manage. The PAIMI budget in particular may be kind of getting lost in that. So there's a lot of kind of unclarity and frustration out there. That said, we have a great example right now going on in with Disability Rights North Carolina, which has really been tackling this issue head on, and they've done some interesting and creative work. So, for example, the PAIMI there and the chief executive officer of the P&A both said to me that they collaborate really well. They make all decisions with respect to mental illness activities together. And recently, they've been collaborating. They highlighted to me how well this collaboration could really work. So you have people with mental illnesses themselves or experience with the mental health system in some way, going into these facilities, talking with their peers, finding out what's going on, reporting that to the lawyers at the P&A, then figuring out together what's the best way and the most practical way that we can actually attack this and go at it legislatively or through some sort of lawsuit or policy work of some kind. What agencies or organizations do we need to be kind of going after, bringing to the table for discussions and so on. And in particular, they had some cases there where they found that parents were actually complaining because they had brought their children in to get mental health help, and then the children were being involuntarily committed and often sent out of state, and the parents were being completely cut out of the loop. And the parents were shocked that this could even happen, were outraged. This kind of came to the P&A, and they started to collaborate with them. They got media attention. Ultimately, that helped get the attention of politicians, and they've really changed some laws there. They've gotten funding directed into non-coercive peer respites, emergency facilities that are alternatives to hospitals. They've gotten some other initiatives like that going. And so it's really quite an astounding and exciting kind of series of developments. And in fact, just this week, they released a report on involuntary commitment in the state, looking at the data, what they know and don't know about what's going on, talking about these kind of initiatives, talking about how brutal and involuntary commitment can be and how often it backfires. And so it is possible to do this kind of work, to find a way to make it work within a particular state, within the budget they have. And that's really exciting. And it'd be nice to see more of that.
I think that is a fantastic example of how this relationship should work with the advisory council and a P&A, is that the advisory council is really a fantastic resource. Not only do they have some authority because they can voice approval or disapproval of how the grant's being spent, but they should be viewed also as a fantastic resource when you're talking about people with lived experience for guidance and insight into what they should be looking at. I mean, it's really hard to have that sort of insight if you haven't experienced the system. If you've worked as an attorney, you may have represented people, but the people with lived experience have gone through something that is almost incomprehensible unless you have gone through it. And so that's, I think, a fantastic example of how that relationship could work.
Exactly, Jesse. And I want to circle back now to something you had mentioned lightly earlier on, but is really important for people to understand. So, the definition of lived experience for the purposes of this particular piece of legislation is broader than just people who have had experience in the mental health system as users, consumers, or survivors of that. But actually, there was pressure even back at that time to broaden it out to include, say, family members of people who've been in the system. And that's important because that has really changed the politics of all this. And as a result, what we've seen is family members who are often some of the most active family members are actually pro supporters of forced treatment. And Treatment Advocacy Center, National Alliance on Mental Illness being two organizations that often feature these kinds of family members. And so, for example, in Disability Rights Iowa, director, an actual working professional director of Treatment Advocacy Center, which is one of those prominent pro-forced treatment organizations in the country, is actually on the PAIMI advisory council there. So you're not going to get any kind of real serious commitment from them to fight involuntary commitment when you've got pro forced treatment people sitting on their boards. And so I want to highlight that because there is this extreme out there. We're seeing some supposed disability rights organizations, these P&As, that are supposed to be fighting for the rights of people labeled with mental illnesses. And instead, they're actually, in how I would interpret it, fighting against those rights. They're redefining those rights altogether as somehow being, your right to be involuntarily committed, your right to be treated against your will. And this is a real distortion of the original intention of the act. And so that's a really bad thing. And I want to highlight that this goes deeper than that. So, for example, it's not even clear to me that SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, through which this funding goes and which has oversight authority, is actually truly supportive of any kind of battle to defend the rights of people labeled with mental illnesses, particularly when it comes to involuntary commitment. And an amazing example of that was when KK and Jim were making a presentation last year about their PAIMI empowerment project, educating people about some of these issues we've been talking about. A representative from SAMHSA, Lisa Stallworth, stepped into that meeting. It was online, and I was there at the time. It's all available online for people to see. It's been recorded. And she really, in no uncertain terms, seemed to me to be trying to shut the whole meeting down and saying, you don't have authority to have this meeting without running it through SAMHSA first. SAMHSA has the final say on any kind of public presentations that have to do with protection and advocacy organizations, particularly the PAIMI project, and not the PAIMI project, but PAIMI advisory councils generally. This was her argument. And she didn't just say it once. Here she was going up against Jim Gottstein, a prominent lawyer in the area. It was just like, what are you saying? You have no authority to say this. We're simply a group of people talking about this issue. And then, minutes went by, and it came up again that she was trying to kind of tell them that they didn't have authority to run this meeting. It was incredibly intimidating, even for me just watching it, let alone for the people who were presenting and the other people participating. Ultimately, the meeting did go on, and she relented and sounded more inviting towards the end, inviting people to reach out to her to talk to her, which I will note that she totally never responded to when I and others did reach out to her to discuss these issues. And SAMHSA also refused my requests for interviews to discuss that intervention that she did, as well as these broader issues. So it just highlights that we're already in a odd political climate around these, and it's getting worse too. Jesse, do you want to comment on that in any way?
There's so much there to comment on. I'll start with with Lisa Stallworth, who I don't know. I can't speak to her work with SAMHSA. The only thing I can think is that she might have thought that people in that meeting were there representing their views in their capacity as a council member. So if they're on a PAMI advisory council and they go to a meeting saying, as my position in an advisory council informs me, here is the correct interpretation of the PAMI authority, that would actually be something Lisa could comment on. But there is no even far-fetched argument for her to think that she could shut down Jim Gottstein. He's a private citizen. You can disagree with him. You can find his views really problematic, but you can't enter a meeting and shut him down. Like, SAMHSA has no authority to do that. That's what I find just really perplexing about that situation. There is no argument for her to have any input into Jim Gottstein's speech. So I find that bizarre. The lived experience aspect of it, I think, is a great example of one of the reasons why I'm trying to exercise caution in how these PAMI statutes are interpreted, because the people from places like NAMI and the Treatment Advocacy Center, I mean, I think the Treatment Advocacy Center has done more harm to the rights of people with perceived to have psychiatric disabilities. TAC has done more harm than any other organization I can think of in this country. So for the organization that has done more harm to our rights than anyone else, for them to be deliberately trying to infiltrate these boards with their members to push their agenda, that is precisely why I think we need to be cautious about what sort of claims we make about the advisory council's authority. Because if you have in Iowa a council being led by TAC people, they're going to say, well, it is beneficial to the rights of people to be involuntarily hospitalized. It's an argument they make that I find offensive and ridiculous, but they make it. And some of them actually truly seem to believe it. They have horrible sayings, which I won't repeat here, but they genuinely advocate for depriving people of their rights, for dehumanizing people as a means of respecting them. It doesn't make any sense to me, but that's their belief. And if they run a PAIMI advisory council and they actually have veto power and authority over what the P&A does, I want that P&A to say, hey, we hear you, but what you're asking us to do would be violating our clients' rights. It would be violating the rights of the people we're here to protect.
Well, that's a really interesting point, Jesse. I just want to intervene on that because, this came up in an investigation at Disability Rights California where the P&A was trying to control who wasn't on the PAMI Council, but the PAMI Council itself didn't have that authority, and that was clearly incorrect under the statute and has been corrected since. But this is something, and then Disability Rights North Carolina, they made it very clear to me that ultimately the PAMI Council itself has the authority to decide who's going to be on the council, and they look for people that have a rights lens in the true sense of the word, not the distorted version that Treatment Advocacy Center and NAMI sometimes put forth, but rather people who truly understand what it means to be a person with a disability and to want your own rights protected, your own agency protected. So that's a really important piece of that puzzle. And I want to highlight here that, I want to confess in a way that when I started this work on this article 8 months ago, we were in a very different political climate, and things have really changed, and now these P&As and these PAMI councils are actually under threat to get any funding. The current proposed budget I saw suggested that they might have a fairly substantial cut. We've seen some groups actually lobbying to get rid of them altogether, some of these pro-force groups out there. So, I confess I have mixed feelings even now as we're sort of critiquing them. We are trying to highlight the important and valuable work they do, but also highlighting these ways in which some at least are not meeting their mandates. And I do feel, a little bit troubled right now about the state we're in. How about you?
The leaked proposed budget cut from HHS, which suggested that they might be cutting P&A funding, is frightening because I don't see a reasonable argument for it. Even when the pro-commitment people who have tried to suggest cutting the P&A funding, they usually cite some economic reason, like, well, we could better spend this money somewhere else. There has been bipartisan support of P&A funding for decades. It has been expanded in different administrations, both Republican and Democrat, not just through the human rights and compassion lens, which should be enough. You should care enough about human rights and compassion to want these sorts of organizations, but for the people for whom compassion and human rights aren't a selling point. Economically, they are the organization that investigates fraud. They are looking at fraud into Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. If you want to make sure federal money is being spent and used appropriately, these are the organizations you want. You will more than get a return on the investment you're giving into watchdog organizations like this. So not only does it frighten me as an individual who has got through a civil commitment and has those labels, like I know I'm on lists. I know that there are lists there that say I can't do certain things. Not only does it frighten me that the only organization that is given independence to hopefully safeguard people like me and our rights, it frightens me that they might have their funding cut. It also just is so short-sighted and does not make any sense other than for some sort of political talking point, which is such a sad state to be in.
Yeah, here, Jesse. I agree with you totally on that. It's frightening to me too. We're definitely talking about simply trying to improve these organizations, make them more aligned with the people who are actually experiencing these kinds of abuses. And absolutely, I don't support any kind of cuts. In fact, I think they deserve more money than they're getting. And it would be great to see them have an even more investigative powers, more authorities, and more ability to look at this. Because, yeah, if there's anything that we're finding is rampant in some of our other talks, we've been talking about it, is fraud in the mental health system, and especially in the involuntary commitment system. And we need these kinds of organizations, ideally working in collaboration with the Department of Justice, to try to clamp down on that kind of waste and fraud and abuse. And that's the last thing this current budget looks like it's doing.
Mhm.
And that's really unfortunate.
Yeah.
So, Jesse, I really want to highlight, by way of ending this, that people can get involved with the PAIMI councils. There's regular turnover in the membership, and that's one of the PAIMI Empowerment Project. They can go to my article to see a link to that and get involved with Jim and KK, learn more about it, and also just contact directly the P&A in their state and ask about membership and how that they can get involved. It's not uncommon for some of the websites to actually have forms that you can fill out expressing your interest, and get involved and try to steer the PAMI Council and the P&A in your state in the direction you think it should go.
Yeah, I think everyone should at least know what the P&A in their state or territory is. And for anyone who wants to look more at the conversation we've been having, everything we've been talking about was drawn from Rob's article on Mad in America. And the article was called "The Fight Against Involuntary Commitment, Our Protection and Advocacy Organizations Fulfilling Their Mission." So that's a great place to flesh out some of the arguments where we're drawing from. And whatever your P&A is, check it out. They usually have websites with news and updates about things they're doing if you want to get involved, if you want to help them educate the public, educate legislators, take action. Look for it, get involved.
Thanks so much for this conversation, Jesse. It's been fun once again.
Thank you.